good to see all of you this morning. Did you get that extra hour of sleep last night? All right, good. It's good to have you here this morning. We're going to launch into a new message series this morning called The Deep End. We're going to be in it for 4 weeks. Amy and I, we have 2 sons. One is 20, one is 16. They could not be more opposite of each other. Our oldest one is just very impulsive, very spontaneous, is not afraid of anything, and will do anything. Our younger one is more cautious, more reserved. He wants to make sure it's going to be secure before he jumps into it. This played out no greater way than when they took swim lessons. So Blake, our oldest one, during swim lessons, he would just jump into the water before the instructor was even ready. And moving from the shallow end to the deep end, it didn't bother him at all. Going off the diving board, it didn't bother him at all. He wanted a taller diving board because he just doesn't always think about the consequences. He's just ready to dive in. Jeb, on the other hand, a little bit different story with swim lessons. He went to the Seahorse Swim School. Anybody familiar with Seahorse Swim School? Yeah, a lot of you, I know it's a very popular place in town, so you know how they do things there, which was good for him because he needed a little encouragement and a little pushing. So he didn't even do the shallow end, much less the deep end. And it was really hard to get him to jump into the instructor and get him to follow their wishes and what they wanted him to do. And when it came to the deep end, he didn't want any part of it. He wasn't going to have anything to do with the deep end. And so at the Seahorse, when kids don't really want to jump into the deep end, but they know they're ready to jump into the deep end, they take them to the diving board on the deep end, and they literally throw them into the deep end. And he learned how to swim. If you and I think about it this morning, though, we try to live our life avoiding the deep end. The deep end is where it hurts. The deep end is where we can't touch the bottom. The deep end is we don't know how long we can tread water. The deep end is a scary place. And really, if we're honest with one another this morning, we try to avoid the deep end. And for 4 weeks, we're going to talk about when life throws us into the deep end. Well, what does that look like? Well, it can look like lots of different things, but it can be the journey of grief over losing a loved one that sometimes feels like we're never going to make it back to where we can put our feet on something solid. It could be that call from the doctor that says it's malignant. It could be when your husband comes home from work one day and says, I don't love you anymore and I don't want to be married anymore. It could be when you find out your wife is seeing someone else. It could be when your job is gone. It could be when your money is gone. It could be when you're betrayed by your best friend and he or she doesn't want to have anything to do with you anymore. It could be change in life, any change in life, because life changes and oftentimes we grieve that change because we don't like the change. That happens in church. Church changes because the culture changes, and while the message never changes, we have to change the methods to reach a new generation of people for Jesus Christ. It could be that the expectations you had for your children or your grandchildren aren't where your children or your grandchildren are at, and you grieve the difference between where they're at and the expectations that you had for them. It could be that your daughter has run away and you have no idea where she's at or whether or not she's safe. It could be that you lie awake at night with all of the thoughts running through your mind and you can't get any sleep at all. Or it could be that the darkness you're living in is so overwhelming that just getting out of bed in the morning takes heroic effort. The truth of the matter is that all of us in this room this morning and all of us watching online today are either in the deep end right now, we've spent time in the deep end, we'll be moving into the deep end at some time in the future, or we know someone who's in the deep end. The question is not whether or not we're going to spend time in the deep end. The question is, how do we respond when we're in the deep end? And the Bible talks about two different responses when we find ourselves in the deep end. From page 1 to the last page of the Bible, we find people that were in the deep end, and we see how they responded. And this morning, we're going to talk about two different responses when we find ourselves in the deep end, whatever that looks like for you. And those two responses are this: we can either groan or we can grumble. We can be groaners or we can be grumblers. We can be known for our groaning or we can be known for our grumbling. And this morning, I want to take us on a journey on the difference between those two things. Now, I'm not going to use one text or one passage of Scripture this morning. I'm going to use several different texts of the Scriptures. And so if you've got a Bible with you, I would encourage you to get it in your lap, open it. You can follow along with me. Or if you like to use your phone, you can keep clicking over to the different Scriptures. I'm also going to put them up on the screen, and you can jot them down this week. I'll make 3 points so that you can go back and study for yourself this week whether you're going to be a groaner or a grumbler in the deep end. The first place I want to take us is to the book of Exodus. So turn first to Exodus chapter 2. And I'm going to start reading at verse 23, but let me tell you where I'm at in Exodus chapter 2. So all of Genesis is a long story. Basically, at the end of Genesis, God's people end up in Egypt through Joseph. It's a very interesting story. I encourage you to study it and read it if you don't know anything about it. But they all end up in Egypt, and they're under great favor by the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time. In fact, Pharaoh has put Joseph as vice president of Egypt. He's second in command over all the country. But that Pharaoh passes away, and a new Pharaoh takes his place, and he's not as favorable toward Joseph's people, towards God's people. And so the favor they once experienced under Pharaoh is no longer experienced. And here's where they find themselves in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. They're in the deep end, by the way. And here's what we read starting in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, I love this, and God knew. God knew they were in the deep end. He knew their hurt. He knew their grief. He knew the overwhelming darkness that they were living in. He knew the oppression that covered them each and every single day. God knew because he heard their groans. Their groaning. That word in the Old Testament Hebrew and even in the New Testament Greek literally means a deep sigh of grief. A grief that comes from the deepest part of who we are, from our gut. Literally, it means from our gut. That we offer up this grieving sigh from our gut to God. And I want you to notice that here in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 and 24. Notice where their groans went. At the very end of verse 23, it says, their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. Hang on to that for just a second, will you? That here we see in the deep end, they began to groan. They began to give off these deep sighs of grief for the place that they were in. Now let's contrast that. Flip over to Exodus chapter 14. Let me catch you up on what's happened. God knew the deep end that they were in. He knew the oppression that they were in. He knew the place that they were in. And so he delivered them from that place. He's a good God. He's a faithful God. And he took them out of that place. He raised up a man named Moses to lead them out of the slavery they were experiencing in Egypt. And now they're in the wilderness. And they're going to end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And guess what? There's not a lot of in the wilderness. Water or food. And so let's pick up reading in Exodus chapter 15, verse 24. Exodus 15, 24. And the people, watch, grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? You see the difference? Now they're no longer groaning, they're grumbling. And grumbling is very different from groaning. It's not offering up this deep sigh of grief, it's complaining. It's a word that means complaining in the Old Testament Hebrew and in the New Testament Greek. It means they're complaining, they're murmuring, they're grumbling. And I want you to pay attention to who they're complaining to. They're complaining to God, to Moses, about who? About God. Point number one, are you a groaner or are you a grumbler? If you're a groaner, you raise up a sigh of grief to God. If you're a grumbler, you complain to someone else about God. Oh, that's good. Write that down. If you're groaning, you're grieving to God, directly to God. If you're grumbling, you're complaining to someone else about God. Let's look at another difference between the two. Go over to the Psalms. Start in Psalm chapter 6. If you got your Bible open or if you got your phone, you can click over there. Psalm chapter 6. I'm going to read verse 6. This is a psalm written by David in one of his confessions to God. And here's what he says. I am weary with my moaning. Same word as groaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. David is confined in his bed, in his couch, and he is groaning to God. He's offering up this deep sigh of grief to God. It's just David and God. And he's offering up this place of grief. Listen, if you find yourself in the deep end, or if you are trying to help someone who's currently in the deep end or in the deep end any time in the future, the Psalms is a great place to start. The Psalms are a collection of writings that are the most emotionally intense writings in all of literature. And they describe all of the emotions that you and I can feel. And listen, the thing about the emotions is that God gave you and I these emotions. He gave you and I tears. Tears are all over the Bible. In fact, there's some 70 references to crying or to tears in the Bible. Jeremiah, one of the prophets, is known as the weeping prophet. John 11:34, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. There's a psalm that says Jesus collects all of our tears. He knows every one of them that falls and collects them in a bottle. You see, here's the thing. Oftentimes when we find ourselves in the deep end and we begin to process this grief and we start to process all these emotions and we begin to feel these things and we can't even really identify everything that we're feeling. And oftentimes we want to ignore those feelings. We want to stuff those feelings and we want to run away from those emotions. And God gave us those emotions and He wants us to process those emotions in a very healthy way. And the healthy way is to groan to Him. To cry to Him, to cry out, God, I don't even know what I'm feeling. I don't even know where I'm at. I don't even know how to describe this right now, but I'm in my bed, I'm on my couch, and I'm just crying. I'm just weeping to You because here's what I've got. It's so intense, I don't even know how to name it. Here's where I'm at, God. It's just me and You. Well, let's contrast that with another psalm. Turn over to Psalm 106. Verse 25. And here we see a reference to God's people in the wilderness again. Notice the difference. They murmured, they grumbled. They grumbled where? In their tents, and did not obey the voice of the Lord. Do you see the difference between the two? David was groaning to God. They were grumbling in their tents. Here's point number 2. Groaning is face to face with God. Grumbling is behind God's back. Groaning is face to face with God. Grumbling is behind God's back. Now, we can really never be behind God's back, but isn't that the irony of grumbling, is that we think we can be behind God's back? That we can grumble in a way that He's not going to find out or doesn't know anything about. And I'm trying to think, what would be today's correlation to tents. I mean, we don't live in tents. We live in our house, but that's where our bed, our couch is. I mean, what was the tent? It was kind of the public place where it might be equivalent today to our small group. It might be equivalent to Facebook or any other social media outlet. That we're trying to we want everyone to know the despair that we're in. We want everyone to know that God hasn't been good to us. We want everyone to know that we're in this totally unfair, deep-end situation that we never asked to be put in. But it's not face-to-face with God. It's behind his back in our tents. Third point, third contrast between groaning and grumbling. Let's go to Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 6 says this: "As for you, son of man, groan. With breaking heart and bitter grief, groan before their eyes." Here's what he's saying. He's saying, I want you to groan. I want you to come face to face with me and grieve over whatever it is you're grieving. I want you to come face to face with me, and I want you to tell me where you're not happy with the change that's happening in your life. I want you to come face to face with me, and I want you to grieve where you find yourself in the deep end. He commands groaning. He commands it. Let's see what he prohibits. You'll find this in the New Testament in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. I bet you can guess it already. Do all things without what? Grumbling. He commands groaning. He prohibits grumbling. So, question for all of us this morning. In the deep end, are we groaning or are we grumbling? Are we grieving to God or are we complaining about God? Are we face to face with God or are we trying to go behind his back? Are we doing what he commands or are we doing what he prohibits? In the deep end, are we groaning or are we grumbling? Along the way in this message series, we're going to show you some testimonies of people who find themselves in the deep end or found themselves and are now at a place where they can share their story. This morning, we're going to start with Emily Landry's story. And as you watch her story, I want you to find whether she's groaning or grumbling. Watch.
Before I was married, I came from an estranged family. My connection with my family wasn't as deep, and so I think that marriage was a little bit more critical for me than maybe others. Going through the divorce process, I feel like it was a little bit more difficult because I probably put a lot more emphasis on my marriage being the true network of my family. My divorce wasn't the typical divorce. It was probably a little bit more difficult than others, in that there was many other people that had to be involved, sadly. It also came as quite a bit of a shock for me, but I think most people, when they get married, they don't get married thinking, I'm gonna get a divorce. Through that process of figuring out that I wasn't going to have the family that I was pretty vested in, I made up my mind that I was going to try to cope with everything to the best of my ability and really try to come out of this with a lot of character in the end. Some of the things that I focused on through the grief process were, in the beginning, ways to distract yourself, probably. I finished painting the entire house with 20-foot ceilings, redid a flower bed, and learned how to do all different projects around the house. And part of it, too, was typical coping mechanisms of reading and writing. And through that time, I also read Max Lucado's Anxious for Nothing. Through that, I think I really began the actual grieving process, because I started writing down thoughts and prayers, and started with prayers of thanksgiving in order to refocus through the times that there are just days that it's just hard to get through. God gave me tons of blessings in seeing just how every little piece of the puzzle started to make sense. Another thing that was huge for me was keeping good friends very close. And so I had 2 close friends who took my phone call at all times. And those friends meant the world, because they act as a counselor in many different ways. I often heard that divorce is much like a roller coaster that you're on, and you never can really depict when something's going to happen, or when an emotion kind of comes up and takes you by surprise. Some of the emotions that come on early can be guilt. You have guilt for anything that you want to really blame yourself, whether it be, I didn't do this, I did too much of this. I had days where I just felt like a complete failure. And so, knowing that the intention of any relationship is not for it to end, brings on a whole lot of just feeling as if you were inadequate. Probably most importantly is to give yourself grace as you go through grieving. We tend to beat ourselves up with how we deal with grief, and giving yourself grace, knowing that if you're dealing with grief, in the end, it meant that it mattered. Things that I have learned about God would just be that He truly is brokenhearted right beside you as you go through pain. He's there, and you can feel His mercy and His grace as you go through these things. There's no sense of tough love there. Even if you have guilt over your grief, that God loves you and He's compassionate no matter what.
That's Emily's story. What's your story? What's your deep end? And what's your response to that deep end? You know, I'll never forget the day that Jeb got thrown into the deep end. We didn't know if he could do it, but you know what he started doing? He started swimming. Because it's often in the deep end that God does His best work. But ironically, we want to try to avoid the deep end. We want to try to come into church and act like our head's above water in the shallow end. But truth be told, we're treading and we don't know how much longer we can do that. Would you just close your eyes for a second? If you're here this morning and you would admit that you're in the deep end, would you just lift your hand? Thank you. I want to pray for you. God, I thank you for those courageous enough to admit that they're in the deep end today. That they're overwhelmed, that life is dark, that they're grieving. God, you know every circumstance. Just as we read this morning about the people enslaved in Egypt, you knew. You know every detail of every one of our lives. And God, I just pray for whatever details you know in this room this morning, that God, you would do your best work in the deep end. And God, we know that that begins by groaning, not by grumbling, but by groaning. And so, God, I just pray that you would give those who lifted their hands and those who didn't lift their hands the courage to groan to you this morning, face to face. You commanded us to do that. God, give us the courage to do that. God, I pray for those in the room that have been grumbling. God, you would just bring us to a place of confession and repentance, and you would change our grumbling to groaning. The prayer team is going to come down to the front of the church. They're going to stand across the altar here, and I would invite you, anyone who lifted your hand or anyone else who didn't, if you need to come and groan face to face with God, you come and meet one of these who would love to pray over your groaning. If you prefer to do it in private, you can come and just kneel at the altar and spend some time there, groaning to God about the deep end.